Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back our online audience. We've had to move the screen because of the sun coming in these windows. So we are ready for our second lecture, which is on Psalms 120 to 134, and the title is The Embodied Praise of God in the Songs of Ascents. Let's welcome our guest back again.
Is that better? There we go. Shall I start over for our online groups? Okay, we're going to move to a new topic, the Songs of Ascent, Psalms 120 to 134, and apply another way of looking at them, embodiment, a new endeavor for me. I've been a student of the book of Psalms for over 30 years, and just when I think I have arrived, that I've engaged this magnificent book in every way possible, that I've explored all avenues to its understanding, another challenge presents itself to me. And that's certainly the case with the current topic, embodiment in the Songs of Ascents. As I hope I conveyed well in my earlier lecture, I am an unashamed proponent and student of the canonical shape and shaping of the book of Psalms. I maintain steadfastly that it is purposely shaped to tell a story, as I stated, a story that begins with the reign of King David and ends with the resettlement of the Babylonian exiles in Jerusalem under the Persian Empire. Thus, much of my focus during my academic career has been on more of the historical, shaping aspects of the Psalter. But a few years ago, I was approached by a liturgical press to contribute a volume on books 4 and 5 of the Psalter, Psalms 90 through 150, to their Wisdom Commentary series. The commentary series is a broadly feminist approach to the biblical text. Barbara Reed, the general editor for the series, describes it in this way. The series is intended for clergy, teachers, ministers, and all serious students of the Bible. Designed to be both accessible and informed by the various approaches of biblical scholarship, it pays particular attention to the world in front of the text. That is, how the text is heard and appropriated. At the same time, this series aims to be faithful to the ancient texts and its earliest audiences. Thus, the volumes also explicate the worlds behind the text and within it. While issues of gender are primary in this project, the volumes also address the intersecting issues of power, authority, ethnicity, race, class, and religious belief and practice. And I'll just take an aside here, those examinations of the enthronement psalms that I presented last hour grew out of what I'm putting together for this commentary project. Thus, I've added to my shape and shaping toolbox a new tool, a new way to look at the book of Psalms. I began to study the texts of books 4 and 5 of the Psalter from a new and different perspective. One, as I said, that you heard in the previous lecture. I found feminine images of God in Psalm 90, ecological understandings of the text in the enthronement psalms, and though there was not time to cover them in the previous lecture, a few other broadly feminist concepts that, if you'll indulge me momentarily before we move on to the Song of Ascents, I'll offer briefly here. As you recall, the singer of Psalm 90 celebrates God who in verse 2 birthed the earth and the habitable world. Here we see a wonderful feminine image of God. In Psalm 90, verse 1, we read in the New Revised Standard, "You who live in the shelter of the Most High," in Hebrew, Elyon, "will lodge in the shadow of the Almighty." Only here and in Psalm 68, verse 15, is God called Almighty, which in Hebrew is Shaddai. And that's only in the Psalter. Of course, God is called Shaddai in other places. Some scholars maintain that the basic meaning of the word Shaddai is breast, shad. while others, that mountain is the reference for the word, and thus understand Shaddai as God of the mountains. But I suggest that if we move backward to Psalm 90, verse 2, and forward to Psalm 91, verse 4, as we attempt to find the meaning for Psalm 91's use of the designation Shaddai, we might come across some interesting information. Although the meaning and interpretation of Shaddai is a disputed issue, I suggest that we are permitted to understand the epithet in Psalm 91 as a reference to the nurturing God who birthed the habitable world, back in Psalm 90, and now suckles it at the breast. References that tie nurturing breasts to God and God's goodness are numerous in the Hebrew Bible. At Genesis 49:25, and that's the poem of Jacob's blessing to his sons, in this instance Joseph, connects the blessing of Shaddai with the breast, Shaddayim, and the womb, Rechem, remember that word. In Isaiah 66:11, Zion is a consoling breast, Shad. And Naomi states in Ruth chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, Shaddai has dealt bitterly with me and brought calamity upon me. A reflection perhaps of her now barren state. Both of her sons have died, and she has no grandsons. Verses 3 and 4 of Psalm 91 employ avian imagery to depict the dangers that especially threaten young birds, the fowler snare, and the threat of predators. Uses these images to provide assurance that God will shelter the psalmist with protective wings and pinions and ensure safety and nurturing. While there are varying understandings of winged God images in the ancient Near East, I believe that, again, in the context of Psalms 90 and 91, Yahweh's winged protection in Psalm 91:4 is best understood as the protection a mother gives to the child whom she has born, suckled, and taught to live in a world where adversity presents itself on every side. Thus, the psalmist will not fear, in the words of verses 5 and 6, the terror and pestilence of the night, or the arrow and destruction of the day. And then Psalm 92, before we move on to the songs of ascents, I find that the words of verse 12 are particularly intriguing from a gender standpoint. There, the righteous are likened to the palm tree and the cedar of Lebanon. I suggest that what we have here are two common images of strength and longevity from the ancient Near East, set alongside one another in poetic parallelism, one feminine and one masculine. The palm tree mentioned here, and the Hebrew word is tamar, is most likely the date palm, a long-lived tree that provided many staple items of the ancient Near Eastern diet of both humans and animals, and as well provided food for various household projects. It is a symbol of life-giving water in the biblical text. Recall that just after crossing the Reed Sea, the wandering Israelites come to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Tamar is, of course, the name of 3 significant female biblical characters. The word is used in Song of Songs, chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, as a metaphor for the woman sought by her lover. We read in the New Revised Standard Version, "You are stately as a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I say I will climb the palm tree and lay hold of its branches. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vines, and the scent of your breath like apples." And in Judges 4:5, we read that Deborah sat under a palm tree as she judged Israel. The palm tree, thus, seems to be associated in the Hebrew Bible with the feminine and fertility. The cedars, the eras of Lebanon, convey a more masculine imagery. They were connected with longevity, majesty, strength, and were symbols of royal power. Recall that according to 2 Samuel 5, verse 11, and 2 Samuel 7, verse 2, David's temporary housing for the tabernacle, and then in 1 Kings 5, 6 through 10, Solomon's choice of building material for the Jerusalem temple was the cedars of Lebanon. The palm tree and the cedar of Lebanon, thus, were 2 powerful images of the strength and resilience of the people of God, one feminine, the other masculine. And that's just a few examples of the way in which putting a new and different tool in my toolbox putting on a different lens as I examine the text, has led me down new paths and into new ways of understanding the words of the psalmist. And if the image on this path is a bit dark, and it's even darker on the screen, well, that's been my experience as I embark on this new journey, a path that few have trod when it comes to the book of Psalms, but I hope many will follow. So we're going to take a look now at the Song of Ascents and their images of embodiment. And again, the Songs of Ascents are Psalms 120 through 134, found in Book 5. But for me, before I could begin such a study, I had to come to a clear definition of the term embodiment, especially as it relates to the biblical text. A number of terms parallel and yet contrast with it. Metonymy, synecdoche, and metalepsis, for instance. Each seemingly related to that concept of metaphor by employing both vehicle, that is the metaphoric image, and the tenor, the concrete reality being described metaphorically. So all of these sort of use that vehicle and tenor in one way or the other. For the uninitiated like myself, here are some brief examples and definitions of the terms. Metalepsis, a word or phrase from a figure of speech used in a new context. Thus, catching the worm is a phrase borrowed from the early bird catches the worm to characterize the one who rises early to achieve success. Synecdoche names a part to represent the whole or names the whole to represent its parts. Thus, bread and butter is a synecdoche for a person's livelihood, naming a part to represent the whole. Wall Street to refer to the myriad financial entities of the United States, naming the whole to represent its parts. And then metonymy, closely related to synecdoche with two definitions, one similar and one dissimilar to it. First, as with synecdoche, metonymy names the whole to represent the parts. Second, metonymy is a figure of speech that replaces the name of a thing with the name of something else with which it is closely associated. So in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, Mark Antony says to the people of Rome, "Friends, countrymen, lend me your ears," using the word ears as a representation of giving attention to what he is about to say. For embodiment, I found three definitions. First, giving concrete form to an otherwise abstract idea. Second, giving a body to a thing that usually doesn't have one. And third, a concrete representation of an otherwise nebulous concept. I'm most drawn to the first one, giving concrete form to an otherwise abstract idea, since biblical Hebrew is, in my experience of translation, interpretation, and commentary, a very concrete language, a concreteness that is often masked or understated in translations of the Hebrew Bible, much like we saw in the last lecture, these words that have been more abstracted that actually have those concrete roots in Hebrew. Thus, in this presentation, I will examine embodiment in the Songs of Ascents as giving concrete form to an otherwise abstract idea. I'll begin with a summary of various scholars' questions and understanding of embodiment in the Hebrew Scriptures, and then discuss how those understandings helped focus my study further, one step beyond giving that concrete form to that abstract idea. And then I'll move on to the Songs of Ascents themselves. Tamar Kamiankowski poses a number of questions in her edited work, Bodies, Embodiment, and Theology of the Hebrew Bible. She asks, how is the dynamic of human relationship with the divine mediated through bodies? And how are bodies in the various shapes and states constructed in the text of the divine-human encounter? In an article titled Embodied Knowing, Embodied Theology, What Happened to the Body. I love that title. Bonnie J. Miller McLemore reminds us that ideas about the body and its functions are culturally driven and influenced. She states, "The body is not simply a physical entity. It is always already shaped by culture." And she states that while we talk about embodied theology or embodied knowing, we actually talk or know little about what it means to know through our material bodies. Since, and I quote her again, "Westerners are shaped by a long history of dualism between body and mind, and detachment from bodies is often considered a sign of intellectual and spiritual maturity." Sam Gill, in an essay entitled Embodied Theology, confirms Miller McLemore's conclusion, pointing out that in Western thought, the body is formed by culture and history rather than how being in actual bodies forms culture and history. Let me repeat that. He points out that in Western thought, the body is formed by culture and history rather than how being in actual bodies forms culture or history. He offers an excellent example that would resonate nicely with nearly all of us in this room. Our academic and liturgical robes reflect and enact, he writes, our deepest cultural and religious beliefs about the body. Such garments transform the human body into a cloth-covered pedestal on which is prominently displayed the all-important head, the domain of mind and spirit. Everything else from the neck down is under suspicion, and so its articulation, its sexuality, its fleshiness is to be covered, suppressed, denied. And I admit, I wear a robe when I preach. And now on to the poetry of the Psalter. It, and I assume no one would disagree, is very embodied poetry. The psalm singers bring their whole beings and bodies to the interaction with God. Susan Gillmeier-Bucher, in the article Body Images in the Psalms, maintains that there are more than 1,000 explicit references to the body and its parts in 143 of 150 psalms in the Hebrew Psalter. She writes, "The persons in the Psalms do not so much have a body, they rather are a body." She goes on to say, the body is deeply symbolic in human culture, the means by which and through the person and the community express themselves. The most intriguing and formative insight for me, though, was Gillmeier-Bucher's statement that the use of body imagery in the Psalter always includes some kind of body performance. It puts the body on stage. Instead of a static description, the presentation of the body shows the events as they unfold. And so I chose to examine not the body parts mentioned in the Song of Songs, although such would be a fruitful avenue of investigation, but rather, in keeping with Gillmeier-Bucher's comments about performance language, I've concerned myself with those words and phrases in the Songs of Ascents that describe the movement of bodies, both in terms of our modern understanding of embodied movement and in an attempt to address Miller McLemore's contention that the body and its functions are culturally driven and influenced. So, with all of this in mind, what do the Songs of Ascents tell us about embodied worshipers coming into the presence of Yahweh? The common superscription of these 15 psalms is literally the Song of the Ascents, Shir HaMa'aloth. The verbal root of ascent is Allah, to go up, and the frequent references to Jerusalem and Zion in this collection of psalms, and I've listed them here, most likely account for their superscriptions and their grouping together. Jerusalem sits on a hill, so no matter where one comes from, one always goes up to Jerusalem. Pilgrims on their journeys to Jerusalem may have sung the Songs of Ascents. And although these 15 psalms most likely come from a variety of times and places in ancient Israel, the message of the collection as a whole is that Jerusalem is the place for the coming together of the people of God, for celebrations and commemorations, and for acknowledging the goodness and help of the God of the Israelites. The Mishnah suggests that the ascents referred to in Psalms 120 through 134 are the steps of the temple, which Ezekiel indeed calls ascents, ma'aloth. In Ezekiel 40, verse 6, the prophet sees a man going into the gateway of the temple, going up Allah, its steps, ma'aloth. We read in the Mishnah of the Levites on harps and on lyres, with cymbals and with trumpets and with other instruments of music without number, upon the 15 steps leading down from the court of the Israelites to the women's court, corresponding to the 15 songs of ascents in the Psalms. Upon them, the Levites used to stand with musical instruments and sing hymns. Other scholars suggest that the title Song of Ascents is a reflection of the very structure of this collection's psalms. Within each psalm, and often as an inclusio around the verses of each psalm, the Songs of Ascents contain verbal step connections that move the reciters through the cola and strophes of the psalms. Whatever their origin, these pilgrim songs became a part of a number of festal celebrations in Jerusalem. Within the songs themselves, I count no less than 20 references to bodily movement, among them wandering or sojourning, ger, in Psalm 120, verse 5, going out, yatsa, and coming in, bo, in 121:8, standing, amad, and going up, Allah, in 122, 2 and 4, seeking, bakash, in 122:9, lifting up, nasa, the eyes, in 121, and lifting up, nasa, the hands, in 134:2, planting, zara, and reaping, katsar, in 126:5, and rising early, shakam, and sitting down, yashav, in 127:2. Bodily movement is, of course, tied to body parts. In the Songs of Ascents, the movements we encounter involve the feet, wandering, going in and coming out. The eyes, seeking and lifting up. The hands, lifting up. The back, along with the hands and feet, planting and reaping. And the whole body, rising early and sitting down. What is the narrative effect of these embodied references in the Songs of Ascents? What is the desired outcome of the rhetoric used? As we ponder this question, recall Gilmeyer Bucher's statement that for the reader, hearer of a psalm, these body images and movements are translated according to the reader or hearer's own body experience, as well as the culturally coded meaning associated with specific body parts. Thus, we as readers and hearers cannot bring our own experience of body and movement to the text. But I'm seeking to understand the words of embodied movement not as metaphoric references to body parts, but as genuinely bodily manifestations of reverence and worship. To quote Miller McLemore, I want to put the physical body back into embodied knowing and theology. Gilmeyer Bucher expands on the idea and writes, the way the body and its parts are used shapes substantially the development of the line of thought and the discourse of the psalm. I would add that the way the body moves also shapes the discourse of the psalm, that is, the rhetoric of the psalm. I'm going to attempt to apply the principles of the rhetoric of embodied movement in the context of social and cultural constructs to two of the Songs of Ascents in our limited time this morning, Psalms 122 and 126. I will offer a brief background and interpretation of each, and then address its words of embodied movement, discuss how such words shape the discourse of the psalm, and suggest its possible culturally coded interpretations. So we begin with 122. It is classified as an individual hymn of thanksgiving whose theme is Jerusalem or Zion, and thus may be more specifically classified as a song of Zion. In the psalm, we hear the voice of an individual singer who is part of a larger group of pilgrims going up to Jerusalem. J. Clinton McCann suggests that if we read the Song of Ascents as a chronological count, that is, in the shape and shaping of these, of a pilgrim's journey to Jerusalem, then Psalm 120, the first of the 15, is a lament of an individual who is far from the holy city and is besieged by falsehood, deceitfulness, and haters of well-being. The next Psalm, 122, is a hymn of thanksgiving, sung on the approach to Jerusalem as the hills of the city come into view, and God guides the singer's feet. And then Psalm 122, our focus here, the third of the songs, is sung in celebration as the pilgrim psalm singer arrives in Jerusalem and enters the city gates. Oops, wrong way. Psalm 122 employs numerous references to bodily movement in its 9 verses. It begins in its superscription with that usual notice of going up, ma'aloth, and is followed in verse 1 with the invitation to go, halak, to the house of Yahweh. These words, read in concert with verse 4's note that there, that is Jerusalem, there the tribes of Yahweh go up, Allah, echo a standard call to a pilgrimage in the Hebrew Bible, in which the verbs go, halak, and go up, Allah, are either used interchangeably or together. In 1 Samuel 11:14, Samuel speaks to the people, "Come, let us go, halak, to Gilgal." Jeremiah 31:6 says, "Arise, let us go up, Allah, to Zion." And in Isaiah 2:3, and echoed in Micah 4:2, or the other way around, the vision is for a time when many people would say, "Come, halak, let us go up, Allah, to the mountain of the Lord." Additionally, the threefold repetition of Jerusalem in Psalm 122, along with the house of Yahweh, house of David, and the dual occurrence of the word there, sham, seem to emphasize its pilgrimage theme. So come, let us go up to Jerusalem there. The psalm singer's words in verse 1, "I rejoiced," samach, set the tone for the remainder of the psalm. The root samach occurs 68 times in the book of Psalms, and in each instance, the rejoicing subject is either animate, as we see, for instance, in Psalm 70, verse 5, 126, verse 3, and so forth, or metaphorically animate. The mountains in 48:12, the heavens in 96:11, the islands in 97:1, or Zion in 97:8, a lot of those enthronement psalms we looked at. What does it mean to rejoice in the cultural context of the psalm singers? Ought we to view it as a static inward emotion of the psalm singer, or as an active outward expression of embodied action? Samach is used in the Psalms in parallel construction with the verbal root gil, which, though most often translated as be glad, means literally to turn oneself around, to tremble, to shake with fear. Slightly like that word chil we looked at before, but nothing to do with childbirth. Samach is also used in synonymous parallelism with ranan, which means to cry aloud, to shout with joy, as you might recall from our discussion of the enthronement psalms. And in Psalm 126, ranan is used in parallel construction with sachak, which can mean laugh, dance, or make merry. I suggest that the psalmist, in embodied rejoicing, that is, raised hands, excited twirling, shouts of joy, heeds the words of those who say, "Let us go, let us walk in embodied movement to the house of the Lord." Verse 2 depicts the feet of the psalm singer and the other worshipers taking their stand in the gates of Jerusalem, that word there is amad. The rather unique use of the subject feet in this verse evokes a physical, embodied image, directing the reader to picture perhaps the dusty feet of pilgrims walking, halak, and taking their stand, amad, in the gates of Jerusalem. I translate the verb amad as taking their stand rather than our feet are standing, because in Hebrew it often evinces the idea of standing in some place for a particular purpose. As we see in Jeremiah 6:16, particular purpose, as we see in Jeremiah 6:16, in anticipation of the occurrence of a particular event, again in Jeremiah 48:19, or in the context of a judicial proceeding, and we read that narrated in Ezekiel 44:24. Verse 3 of Psalm 122 celebrates Jerusalem as a city having been built, banah, as a firmly bound, that is, joined, bounded, compacted, havar entity. Interestingly, and insightful for our discussion here, elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, havar is never used in connection with buildings, but rather in connection with human agreements. J. Clinton McCann again suggests it is possible that it is not so much Jerusalem's architecture that is being praised, but Jerusalem's ability to bring people together. The words of the following verse 4 seem to confirm such an interpretation, where we read that is precisely where the gathered tribes of the Lord go up, Allah. In verse 6, gathered with family and faithful companions, the psalmist admonishes them to ask or inquire, sha'al, for the shalom of Jerusalem and the security of those who love the Lord. Asking or inquiring for peace, in the biblical context, most often is concerned with establishing community, with a genuine concern for the welfare of the party being addressed. Here the party of concern is Jerusalem. As with many of the verbal ideas in Psalm 122, sha'al can be viewed as a static, words-only action. But sha'al in the biblical text seems to convey more for two reasons. First, in nearly all images from the ancient Near East depicting worshipers making requests or inquiring of the deity, the arms and the hands are raised, embodied movements that convey the tenor of the request being made. And second, sha'al is usually accompanied by the verb amar, to say, suggesting an action followed by words of the inquiry. The final verse of Psalm 122 may offer some measure of corroboration for my understanding of sha'al. There we read the psalmist's statement, I will seek, bakash, the good for you. In many places in the Hebrew Bible, bakash is used in synonymous construction with sha'al. Bakash is a verbal root that conveys the idea of a physical activity, not a static, thought-focused undertaking. Clint McCann again. To live for God's sake and for the sake of others is to experience, to embody, and to extend the justice, that is, the good, that God intends. Thus we see in Psalm 122 a call to pilgrimage, a rejoicing, twirling psalmist with hands raised, walking with faithful companions to the house of Yahweh, and together taking their stand in the gates of Jerusalem, the place that brings the kindred tribes together, asking for and actively seeking the shalom and the good for Jerusalem and their kindred. And now on to Psalm 126. It's a community lament, one of only two in the Songs of Ascents. The psalm singers, having arrived in Jerusalem and taking their stand in the gates of the temple, now petition God to restore their lives, just as God had done at some point in their past. Restore them so that they may rejoice once again. James Mays summarizes Psalm 126 as joy remembered and joy anticipated. In its words, we encounter the embodied acts of Yahweh along with humanity's embodied movements. I will limit my comments here, though, to the 13 references to the embodied movement of humanity in its 6 verses. In verse 1, the gathered community recalls the time in the past when Yahweh restored their lives. And verse 2 tells us that in that memory of restoration, laughter, sahak, filled, malah, the people's mouths, and their tongues shouted for joy, renan. Verse 2 contains 2 verbs that you will recall I discussed in the context of Psalm 122. Sahak and Renan. Sahak means to laugh, dance, or make merry, while Renan means to cry aloud, to shout with joy. The embodied picture we have in verse 2 is of pilgrim worshipers laughing and dancing, shouting with joy at the memory of Yahweh's provision for them. The tone turns more somber, though, in verse 4. The pilgrims now present their petition to Yahweh. As you did before, they say, restore us again. Verses 5 and 6 provide a graphic, embodied image of the anguish and hope of the psalm singers. Erhard Gerstenberger points out that the psalmists employ day-to-day images of human toil to describe God's restorative work. The embodied acts of sowing, zarah, and reaping, katsar, with the notice that the task is done with tears, damah, bringing into vivid focus the plight of the psalmists. It seems their very livelihood is threatened. And yet, we encounter words of hope. The reaping, katsar, in verse 5, is not accompanied by tears, damah, but with renan, crying aloud, shouting with joy, giving a ringing cry. The same word we encountered in verse 2 at that memory of restoration. And in verse 6 we read that the one reaping will go, halak, weeping, baka, and lifting up, nasa, the product of the planting, and will enter, lifting up, nasa, the sheaves with a ringing cry, renan. Notice here the quick succession of embodied movement, going, weeping, lifting up, entering, lifting up, giving a ringing cry. Picture it, if you will, the continuous movement. In 126:1, standing in the gates of Jerusalem, the psalm singers recall a past time when Yahweh restored their lives. And with that memory in verse 2, they break into laughter, sahak, and renan, crying aloud. Verses 5 and 6 bring the psalm singers full circle, back to the laughter, the sahak, and the rejoicing, renan, of verse 2. Thus, the rhetorical movement of Psalm 126 is from embodied memory to embodied hope, a celebratory enactment of the good provision of Yahweh for the people. In closing, I offer the words of Maurice Merleau-Ponty in his 1962 work, Phenomenology of Perception. He writes, motion is little more than an instance of cause and effect, but there are occasions of experience where movement is inherently significant and possesses a thematic logic of its own. This is something skillfully employed by the arts, by the media, and of course, by religion. I found these words, by the way, in an unpublished essay by Jonathan Wiedenbaum titled, You Have to Take It With You, The Embodied Nature of the Religious Self. An apt title, I think. Western Christianity has in so many denominational traditions turned religious and worship experiences into static events. We sit in pews, stand for the hymns and scripture reading, mostly the New Testament. I think we should stand for the Old as well, and quietly listen to the morning prayer, the special music, and the sermon with the occasional amen sounded, perhaps depending on your tradition. We do not, for the most part, involve our bodies in our worship experience. We are, as Miller-McLemore writes, shaped by a long history of dualism between body and mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 30 minutes for questions, so if you're
30 minutes.
If we need that much time. So who has the first question here? We've covered. There's a lot of material here and a lot more that can be filled out. So in the Song of Ascents. So she's just touched the surface of the things she knows. So
we can also go back to the previous lecture if folks have
too.
questions. Yeah.
Okay. Again, please state your name and your relationship here.
Well, hi, I'm Mackenzie Mann, and I'm a Master of Divinity and Nonprofit Administration dual degree student. And I've been studying embodiment recently and how our embodiment theology should impact the way the church responds to the Me Too movement.
Okay.
And what I've found a lot is that in the literature, when we're talking about embodiment, there's great discussion on how the fact that we are embodied should impact our faith and our practice and how we treat our own bodies, but there's not much about how we should treat the bodies of others. And I was just wondering if that was anything you had seen in your study of these Psalms, if there's indication of how our embodied reality impacts the way we interact with the people around us, or if it is still more individualistic.
I'm going to steal that from you. I'm stealing two things, right? Okay. I stole something from somebody else. I had not thought about that. I guess I was just looking for, and again, this is a new tool in my toolbox, looking for how these psalms reflect bodily movement and all of that. But I think that's a fruitful area, and I think the Psalter probably has quite a bit to say about how we treat others. I'm thinking of Proverbs as well. So yeah, that not just our own bodies, but how we treat the bodies of others. Remembering that we are all God's good creation. So yeah, it's not something I have researched, but I think something that's very important. Yeah.
Hello again.
I
am Carrie, and I'm a Div student here. So you mentioned that detachment from the embodied self was often, and is often seen as a sign of intellectual and spiritual maturity. And many of the references you had in your lecture were women, and many of the people I know who are interested in learning about the embodied self are women. Do you think that that is because of kind of up until recently the exclusion of women from the intellectual and kind of spiritual, I guess, as well, realms? And if not, why do you is it true that many of the people interested in this are women, and why do you think so? As well as, is the reason we don't see it in many churches because a lot of churches are still predominantly run by men?
Okay, that's about a 6-part question. You know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
I guess start at the beginning. We are products of Western Enlightenment thought, and I think that's where this whole dualism really got going. We can trace it back to Greek and that sort of thought. But that idea that there is this divide between the body and the mind, and that the body is impure, the body is corrupt, and the mind is the seat of all great things that happen. And I think as biblical scholarship has moved along in the past, it's been mostly men who have undertaken that work. I'm a product of the women's movements of the 70s and 80s. I got over it a long time ago, but a product of that. And I think that may be what has sparked and why so many more women are interested. And I also think it's some of it, again, this cultural baggage that we have, that women are the seductresses and we are the sexual beings and all of that. And so I think more of these women. Sam Gill, by the way, a marvelous article, and there's a perfect example of a man very interested in this sort of thing. Clint McCann, who a dear friend of mine from Eden Seminary in St. Louis, has written quite a bit about this. So, there are men who are embracing it. As it happens, as I was preparing this, the articles that seem to come up were mostly women. But I think that's some of what we're dealing with, that we are moving beyond some of those cultural biases that have sort of separated first the body from the mind, but also kind of categorized women as sort of the weaker being, the sexual being, the seductress, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Hi, Hi, I'm Nathan Clayton. I don't have a question, but I have an online question.
Okay.
I'm moderating this session, so let's see. Natalie Liu, who's an online MDiv student in California, has this question for you. And I'll just read it, it's very well put. How can we learn from the global church about embodiment? Have you experienced this? Stories, please.
Okay. All right. Two examples. The school I teach at, McAfee School of Theology, we're in Atlanta. Mercer, by the way, we're a dual campus. Mercer's main campus is in Central Georgia and Macon. We are actually in the hub of Atlanta. And our student body is 50% African American. I think our African American colleagues do a much better job of embodied worship than we do. And we have worship services at school that run the gamut. And so I see that embodied movement. I also have spent a fair amount of time in South Africa and have witnessed Native African worship. My husband and I were driving through a village one time, and there's a whole procession of people dancing and clapping and singing praises to God. So I think, yes, we can learn from a more global viewpoint. Again, we are in this sort of Western staid environment where we all have our assigned pews. Yeah, I'm Baptist, we have our assigned pews. Whether anybody knows or not, don't you dare sit in my pew on a Sunday morning. And we sit. Yeah, so I think more of this embodied. I have a student who ended up doing a PhD at GTU in worship and dance. So she studied, Miriam and some of the dance themes, and so that we've starting to embrace a little bit more of that liturgical dance. Although that's usually watching somebody else do the embodied movement. But yeah, I think we can learn more from our global people, our global contacts. Yeah.
So, Andrea Spicer, I'm a student here at North Park. I'll just jump on what you're saying. So how important do you think that is that we live into that embodied worship? Like, does it really, like for ourselves, maybe on our personal me and Jesus moment, it's great, but really would it be like a catalyst, do you think, for us to live and to go out from that moment on my Sunday morning where I'm clapping my hands and woo, having a good time, right? And being more aware of my embodiment and that being spoken to and experienced. Do you think that that's a catalyst to be able to move out from our places of worship and really embrace that as on a larger scale and the importance of it in our society and culture?
And yes, in a word. Again, we are embodied creatures, and we often say we learn by doing. The raising of the hands and clapping, I think that's a part of it. But also just the idea of taking your stand, walking, that brings additional support, if you will, for what is going on in the worship service. What's the purpose here? Sometimes it would be lament, sometimes it would be raucous praise. But the actions, I think, we teach children songs by, I'm remembering Deep and Wide, they remember those because they have action to go with them. And I think that might be the benefit to us of having a little bit more of our bodies involved in the worship service. Small things like in our tradition now, a lot of folks do communion by everyone coming forward and intinction. And I think that's a way to enhance the embodied movement. Perhaps rather than passing the offering plate, we come forward with our gifts, whatever those gifts might be, and some of those sorts of things. I think it could make a difference. Yeah, in this more postmodern world we live in the back there.
Hi, my name is Ben Bruckner. I'm a MACM student at North Park. I had a question about the arrows and the snare in the Psalm of Ascents. Talking about embodiment, what role do the external images play with regard to that embodiment of worship?
I think some of those inanimate images, they're all tied, though, to what we humans do with them or what happens to us as a result of them. Arrows have to do with the person shooting them and the person receiving them. The snares, the person laying them and what's caught in them. And so I think if we can, and I haven't looked at those psalms in terms of embodiment, but I think if we can not just see it as, and I'm a snare, I'm looking at a net laying on the floor, but who's doing this? What's the purpose of it? What's going to be the result of this? So thinking about how bodies affect these inanimate objects might be a way to look at it. This is your own question now.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'll play devil's advocate and ask, is embodied worship ever so disconnected maybe from the rational, from the Word of God, that it's no longer faithful, no longer useful? Do the Psalms of Ascent remind us of a good connection? Is embodied worship ever so disconnected from the soul, from the mind?
I think it can certainly become that way. That the embodiment we bring to worship, I think, has to be carefully tied to the words that we're hearing, the Word of God that we're hearing. And if it becomes a distraction or totally out in left field somewhere, I think it can actually be a detriment to the worship experience. So carefully analyzing, how do we bring this? And again, I think we can learn a great deal from our ancestors in the faith. They brought their laments to God, but they also celebrated God. 126 is a great example. To start with, we remember the time in the past when you delivered us, when you restored us. And now, here's what's happening to us, and using those images of sowing and reaping and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Hi, Armida Belmonte Stevens. I'm a teaching fellow here. I'd like to maybe go off of a couple of questions that have already been asked. So we've talked a little bit about maybe how non-Western traditions can have something to teach us, and then also this idea about learning through doing. And I'm curious if in the text you see the idea of embodiment or movement leading up to knowledge. There's kind of an epistemological reversal, right? And so I'm wondering if you see that grammatically in the text, such that knowledge of God, or we can talk about spiritual formation, kind of culminating with this knowledge having been preceded by movement or action.
I think a good example is Psalm 126, that we have that call to let's go, and then let's go up, and then taking our stand. And it's at that point then that the psalm singers bring themselves to God and receive from God. So yeah, I think that embodied movement can bring us to a greater knowledge. So yeah, I think so. Can you tell I really like the question time? By the way, I'm going to steal that from you as well.
Hi, I'm Alex Macias. I'm Director of Programming here and a graduate. I have a question. We were saying, actually just to kind of piggyback off of Armida's question about embodiment bringing us to another sort of realm of knowledge, how that might connect to knowledge of our own mortality. I'm thinking about, even in your first lecture with the images of the womb and of labor and the writhing and the dancing and the sort of the beauty, the joy and the pain and the possibilities of new life, but also the very possibility of death in that moment as well. So just wondering what you might see with that connection.
I think all of that, just what, as you said, reminds us of our humanity, of who we are, and our sort of our place within this larger created order. Again, going back to the previous lecture. So yes, I think again, and realizing that we are embodied creatures, and I'm getting there. The older we get, the more we are aware of our bodies and all of that. So yeah, I do. I think that reminds us, and hopefully in a positive way, of our own mortality. Yeah.
I have another online question
Okay.
by Cheryl Holtz-Meekins, who's an online MDiv student.
I think it's MDiv, yes.
I think MDiv. She's been invited to explore more of this meaning of embodiment herself, I guess, as someone who's created a nonprofit to help individuals heal from abuse.
Wow.
What I've realized, she says, is that abuse is an embodied experience. Therefore, the church being a part of an individual's healing and cultural healing must be an embodied response. So her question is, do you find a connection in the Psalms between embodiment and healing? Embodiment and healing in the Psalms. So the healing aspect.
Okay. The first thing I'll say is yes, and I'm trying to think of a good example. And I'm going to go back to 126, that idea of the memory of healing, restoration in the past, and then again, this sowing and reaping. Those are metaphors, and so we could see that as maybe the seeds of abuse sown, but sort of remembering the past, the care, and being able to come through it like that. So yeah, I think the Psalms can talk about that. Absolutely, yeah.
Hi, I'm Hannah Andre, and I teach church history. Whether from the Psalms of Ascent or as an Old Testament scholar generally, would you reject any anthropology that assumes any form of dualism? Or would you say that the Old Testament mitigates against an anthropology that assumes any dualism, or only a dualism that introduces a hierarchy? And how does that relate to, going back to the first lecture, how does that relate to the creation and the creation of humans in the image of God? How do you see those two as related?
The word we normally translate soul in the Old Testament is our word nephesh. And again, these concrete bases to Hebrew words. The word nephesh at its very base means throat. And it has to do with how we breathe, how we eat, how we speak and express ourselves. So soul is a really lousy translation for nephesh. It has to do with the whole being. And I think in the entire Old Testament, we don't have this dualism between body and mind. That's a Hellenistic idea. Maybe go back to Zoroastrianism, all that fun stuff. But in Hebrew, in Hebrew thought, we are whole beings. And I think the creation story, especially in Genesis 2, seems to reflect that God forms this creature, Adam, right, from the Adamah. Y'all learned that in your Old Testament classes, right? Adam is formed from the Adamah, the dirt, okay, that stuff I grow my eggplant in. And so we are part and parcel of the earth, and we have the breath of God blown into us through the throat, the nephesh, the essence of our being. And I don't see that dualism. And so when I read these psalms of worship, they're bringing their whole being. You don't see a lot of the heady mind stuff in the book of Psalms. It's the whole of who I am I'm bringing to this experience. So yes, I think If you read the Old Testament very carefully and look at it, at least in my opinion, yeah, there is no such thing as dualism in that world thought.
Back to me again, sorry. So there's this book called The Body Keeps the Score, which discusses kind of the way that trauma permanently affects our embodied responses to the world. Is there room for, or how does the changed embodied self interact with embodied worship? And is there room for that embodied response to trauma within the embodied church and the way it worships together?
Okay. I have a dear friend and colleague in Psalm Studies, actually co-authored the NICOT series with me, Rolf Jacobson, who lost both legs as a teenager to cancer. When I read, "Our feet are standing in the temple," how is Rolf going to appropriate that? He's in a wheelchair. So yes, I think we bring our embodied selves to the worship experience, and who we are and what we have experienced in life. Certainly, for most of us, not as traumatic as Rolf's situation, but those various traumas that when we bring. I'll use a silly personal story. When I was a child, I was scared to death of the dark. How many of you have that problem? I still know people who are scared to death of the dark. So when you read about the darkness, okay, in the biblical text, for people who are really frightened of the dark, that can really, really get them. So and that's trivial, I realize, but yes, we do indeed bring ourselves, whether it's culturally, socially, or what we have experienced in our own past. Those of us who had abusive fathers, calling God Father is very difficult, and so some of those kinds of things, yeah.
If we're questioned out, I think we can continue to thank our guest and give her a North Park welcome.
And thank you. You've all been very gracious, very kind to listen to me drone on for all this time, and found a bunch of stuff I can steal from you and incorporate into my commentary. So thank you. I appreciate it. That's why I do these things. So thank you. You've been very gracious.
And she did a wonderful job. Just want to remind you that our Lund series continues tomorrow at 9 a.m. We're going to have a New Testament scholar with us, and for those of you who are our students or others who would like to attend, the Theological Symposium begins tomorrow night, and it goes Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and so we're looking forward to that. Thank you so much for those great questions and for your participation. God bless you and have a wonderful day.